What we're going to do is, this is sort of a different style of debate, one that I've very much enjoyed watching. It's more of the Lincoln Douglas style. And as we were talking back there, both Mr. Montgomery and Mr. Victory were arguing about perhaps who is Lincoln and who is Douglas in this particular debate. So this is going to be a lot of fun. The idea is we're going to have 6 questions that are posed throughout the night. We'll alternate each one taking the question first. And so, for example, if Mr. Montgomery were to take the first question, he'll have 2 minutes. And then Mr. Victor would have 2 minutes to respond. And then we'll come back for rebuttal. Mr. Montgomery will have 2 more minutes, and that'll be closed out by Mr. Victor with 2 more minutes. So the hope is to allow for a little bit of banter, a real debate, as opposed to just getting up, giving your talking points, and then moving on to the next question. So that's the idea here. And we'll do 6 questions in that format. And then we wanted to open up for questions from the audience. And Don Petrie, who's helping me with the time tonight, will help facilitate that. I know there's a lot of you that are probably going to have questions. We're certainly not going to get to all of them. So let me go ahead and introduce both of the individuals that will be involved in the debate tonight. Bill Montgomery was first elected Maricopa County Attorney in a special election in 2010, and he was re-elected in 2012 on a pledge to fight crime, honor victims' rights, and protect and strengthen our community. As a West Point graduate, decorated Gulf War veteran, former Deputy County Attorney, has dedicated his personal and professional life to serving others. Please welcome to the stage, Bill Montgomery. And as you can see, Marc Victor is more than excited to get started. Marc Victor, he's an accomplished attorney who is often invited to speak to audiences across Arizona. He's represented clients in more than 1,000 major felony cases, including first and second-degree murder, sex cases, gun cases, major drug cases, complex white-collar cases, federal appeals, and other complex state and federal matters. Jury trial experience includes several murder trials, including death-eligible matters. He's represented clients in many high-profile and media attention cases, and he ran for U.S. Senate as a Libertarian candidate in 2012. Please welcome to the stage, Marc Victor. So I'm going to go ahead and take the stage down here. I'm going to be using a smaller microphone, and I'll leave the microphone here. Mr. Montgomery, we're going to start with you, so I'll go ahead and give you the microphone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, we're going to start with opening statements. Each side will have 2 minutes each. And we'll start with Mr. Montgomery with opening statements.
Sure. At the outset, what I want to say is that the point of view that I'm going to express throughout the evening is not one of the elected chief prosecutor for Maricopa County. Rather, I think for purposes of this particular debate, it's more important to take the point of view of first a fellow American, and then someone who has a conservative political philosophy grounded in the original founding traditions and principles of our country, is steeped in understanding and discussing what is evident in our original founding documents. In doing so, it's important then to also have a discussion and appreciation for what freedom means within the American experience and what we're looking at with respect to what liberty is within the American experience. Too often, as of late, when we've discussed issues involving the encroachment of the federal government and overreach through regulation and the infringement upon personal liberty by the federal government, the debate or the discussion has gone too far in the other direction, elevating the individual to a point of worship of meism, and whatever I want to do, I should be allowed to do, even if you try to allow for the harm principle, which does not provide for responsible public policy making. So that is the direction and the point of view that I'm going to come from. Obviously, my conclusion is different than Mr. Victor, or we wouldn't be here today. But I've got a lot of respect for Marc. I consider him a friend and appreciate his advocacy on particular issues. There just is a very deep disagreement on this one. And I think in terms of it being a disagreement based on principle, it also can be a very constructive and enlightening conversation. And at the end of the evening, the point that I would assert is that attempting to make a substance known to cause harm, that will cause generational issues for our youth and for this country, benefits no one in a positive way, that would help us create a society consistent with Plato, Socrates, John Mill, or others that the Founding Fathers were well steeped in, would conclude would be a good society or a good thing to do.
Thank you, Mr. Montgomery. Mr. Victor.
Well, good evening, everybody. I think that we are living in the most fascinating time human beings have ever lived on the planet Earth. We really hit the jackpot here. I'm not saying things are perfect, and some things are definitely getting worse. But there's many, many reasons to take an optimistic position about what's going on. And I'm talking about a macroeconomic sense. I'm talking about our planet. Our world, we may not realize it, but it's getting more free in a macroeconomic sense. We're getting wealthier. Torture and violence, while not disappeared from the earth, is still here, but it's generally frowned upon. That's different than most of our history. We're getting more civilized. Religious fanaticism is down. We're getting, cooler heads are prevailing to some extent. Trade is rampant. Technology is rapidly increasing our standard of living. Things are moving in the right direction. And we're doing a better job at respecting the rights of other people in lots of different areas. Said another way, we are becoming more libertarian. We're becoming more free. We're starting to figure out the things that are pro-life for our planet. So we shouldn't be surprised at all that this ridiculous, insane, stupid, foolish, huge mistake drug war is coming to an end. This debate's about 20 years too late. I'm here to tell you, it's already over. We have already won this debate. I declared victory a long time ago. It's impossible to live in the United States and not be paying attention to what's happening in our state, in our country, and even internationally. This thing is over. We're going to have a few hiccups here and there, but for the most part, marijuana will be legal in this country and in our world. I just want to finish by saying, in this 2 minutes, the marijuana legalization is but a small piece of a much bigger issue. The question, do you own yourself? And that's what we're here to talk about tonight.
Mr. Montgomery, the first question will be to you. We claim to live in a free society where people are permitted to make their own choices so long as those choices do not harm others. Where does allowing marijuana use fit within your analysis of what it means to live in a society that calls itself free? Is it a false construct to say that you should be able to do anything you wish to your body?
Well, as I alluded to then in my opening statement, it would be a false construct to say you should be free to do anything you want to do. We do live in society with one another. Taking the value of the individual to an extreme to say that you are perfectly autonomous is a fundamental misunderstanding of what it is to live in society within the United States of America. One of the premises for our Declaration of Independence from the King of England was in basis of nature's law and nature's God. And one of the first listing of offenses against King George III was that he would not give assent to laws that were for the public good. We pass laws and we regulate the interactions between human beings, whether it's commercially, personally, criminally, or civilly, on the basis of trying to create a society in which everybody is in fact free to be the best human being they can be. That's what the original philosophers discussed, that in order for something to be the best that it can be, it needs to be consistent with what it was created for. We were not created for a world in which we do anything that we want to do. That is actually trading freedom for a certain kind of slavery, in which we become a slave to our passions, and then we chase around all day long the next thing we want to do. No, there are guides along the road. There are curbs to the streets that we drive in that help us go in the direction for us to get to where we want to be. So it's actually a much more consistent view of what freedom is and understanding liberty for us to live in a society in which there are some restrictions. Those who would stomp their foot and say, I should be able to have ice cream whenever I want it, are just like that 3-year-old. Those who say I should be able to put whatever I want in my body are not taking into account the real effects and harms that are then transmitted beyond just that one individual, beyond just that one house. It goes on into other areas of society, and it makes for a less perfect world. It makes for a more harmful world and a less good America.
Mr. Vicker.
Nobody is saying that you should get to do anything you want. There have to be limits. I'm saying you should get to do whatever you want with your body. It's yours. I know a good place we could draw the line. How about you get to do with your body what you think makes sense, not what Bill Montgomery thinks makes sense, not what I think makes sense, but what you think makes sense. You can do whatever you want with your body, your money, your time, your property. Here's a good place to draw the line. Let's draw the line when it starts affecting another person. When there's a trespass or a fraud or harm, when you're interfering with another person's life. Look, I'm not a utopian. These things can be difficult to work out sometimes, but shouldn't we get a principle that's at least consistent with a free society? Isn't that the right place to draw the line? It's so fun to say we're for freedom, right? We can come in here and we can salute the flag and we can sing songs. Everybody's for freedom. I found comments that Hitler made for freedom. Stalin is for freedom. Everybody's for freedom. Barack Obama's for freedom if you ask him. But saying you're for freedom and being for freedom are different things. The question is, are you big enough? Are you mature enough? Are you human enough? Are you American enough to tolerate that some other competent adult may choose to do something with his or her own body that you don't like, that you don't approve of, right? Isn't this exactly the same issue as the gay marriage issue? Isn't this the same issue really as the slavery issue? Isn't it the same issue as the prostitution issue? Who's in charge here? What I'm saying and what all free people are saying is the person who owns the body ought to decide what goes in.
Mr. Montgomery.
The rhetoric sounds good, but beer philosophies are usually only good when you're drinking a beer. You cannot do whatever you want to do to your own body. You will hurt yourself. You will hurt those around you. You will create an environment then in which moral relativism isn't just something that we're trying to fight off and fight away, but it's something then that becomes the controlling idea for every individual person. You cannot maintain a strong society doing that. There's not a single society in the history of the world that used moral relativism as a guiding principle. Not a single one. Going back to Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, looking at the examined life, in order for human beings to be good and to be the best human being they could be, was to pursue those things that allowed you to utilize your talents and abilities. There is no good that comes from using marijuana to get intoxicated. Now let's be very clear here too, that I'm going to distinguish any medicinal application from the recreational use. Those are two different things. The recreational use of marijuana provides no overarching societal good, zero. And trying to march in that direction and engage in conflating issues of prostitution with recreational use of marijuana or any of the other litany of things that fall under the banner of a misguided notion of freedom does nothing to further this society. Who benefits if generations of Americans to come have a lower IQ, are less enthused about working hard and becoming good human beings? It certainly isn't the United States of America. It's our enemies. And so why we would want to facilitate that in the first place is a very myopic view of freedom at that. Again, freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want to do. True freedom is the ability to pursue and engage in those activities and the fruits of those endeavors that help you be a better human being. And being a better pothead is not being a better human being.
Mr. Victor, final rebuttal.
So true freedom, you heard it, ladies and gentlemen, is doing whatever it is that Bill Montgomery has decided is within the risk-reward ratio that he's decided that's appropriate for you. Because Bill's decided that you shouldn't get to hurt yourself. And Bill's a good guy, and I also consider him a friend. And I know he wants a smaller government, but doesn't he sound like a big government guy, a big paternalistic government guy when he comes up here and says, you might hurt yourself? I got news for you. There are lots of things that you do that hurt yourself. You own yourself, and you are entitled to hurt yourself if you choose. That's part of what's being free, and I know that scares some people because freedom can be really scary. You know, to me, jumping out of a perfectly working airplane, I'm thinking about that and deciding that for me, that doesn't make a lot of sense because I'm thinking about maybe the rush that I might get from such an activity. I'm also thinking about the possible harm. And my choice in regards to skydiving is that I don't want to do it because for all of the reasons Bill points out, right? You might hurt yourself and maybe this doesn't advance society, and a Plato never jumped out of an airplane either. So we should make illegal skydiving. But see, I'm an American and I'm a person who respects freedom. I think you get to make that risk-reward calculation for yourself. I don't get to make that for you. And isn't it interesting that Bill says, well, that's a beer philosophy. You mean beer? Are we talking about alcohol? You mean that horribly destructive drug that's perfectly legal, that Bill is not going to come up here and say we should make illegal, that kills countless more people than the zero number of people that have ever been killed by marijuana? What is it on earth that is slowing down this debate? I don't understand why on earth we oppose this stuff. What would Thomas Jefferson, who smoked plenty of weed, think about this debate?
Mr. Victor, we're going to start with you on this question. Marijuana is known by many as a gateway drug. And the question for you is two-part. Will this therefore lead to an increased use and incidence of heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine use? And number two, is this a victimless crime?
Raise your hand if you've ever used marijuana and have never used another illegal drug. Come on.
You have the right to remain silent.
Okay, there's your proof. Marijuana is not a gateway drug any more than milk is a gateway drug, right? I mean, some people who use cocaine started with milk. Milk must be the gateway drug. But you know, look, my goal as a freedom advocate is not to tell you how to run your life. My job is not to try to figure out ways to get more and more people to choose something other than marijuana. If you're a free person and you're a competent adult and you choose to use marijuana, so long as you can do it in a way that does not create harm to other people, right? So we're not talking about somebody who goes and gets high and can't operate their motor vehicle safely down the road and creates a huge risk of an accident to another person. Can't we deal with that the same way we deal with other drugs? It's like saying we have to make alcohol completely illegal because some people get into a car accident. Incidentally, nobody has ever wandered into my office in 21 years and said, I smoked marijuana, and as a result of that, I got into a car accident. I've had countless car accidents from drunk people. I've had countless domestic violence assaults as a result of people who have used alcohol. Never once has anybody come into my office and been violent in any way as a result of marijuana. If anything, we should be encouraging more people to use marijuana, not less people. But it is not the government's job. When did we become such a bunch of babies that we're so worried about what the damn government is going to recommend for us to do and not to do? We are Americans, and we don't need or want messages from government telling us how to run our lives.
So it's time to point out a couple of continuing fallacies in Marc's argument. Number one, marijuana is not the same thing as skydiving. So just to point that out. I know as a Marine it might be hard to understand that, but I needed to make that point. Secondly is this. It's a good thing that people haven't showed up in Marc's office having gotten in a car accident from smoking marijuana or showed up having engaged in a domestic violence incident having smoked marijuana. But let's see, marijuana is illegal. Alcohol is not. We do have increased rates of use for that. We do have increased rates of DUI fatalities and car accidents, and we're seeing increased rates of marijuana-related accidents and fatalities in both Washington State and Colorado. It's objective data, and it's right there. We would see we would see increased use. We have rates of use in America right now of alcohol for 12 or older in excess of 50%. Alcohol is legal. We have rates of use for tobacco 12 and older in excess of 25%. Alcohol is legal. The rate of use for drugs in America is less than 10%. So yeah, if you legalize it, you will get more of it. We have more abortions now than we did before Roe v. Wade. It's legal now. And that's a fact. If you tell people it's okay to do something or that they can do something within our society, they're going to do it. And it's one of the reasons why you have ad campaigns. It's one of the reasons why you have other efforts for commercial enterprise to try to encourage people to use more of something, because they will do it. And for someone who purports to be a limited government person, you know, all these efforts to try to legalize marijuana and regulate it is doing nothing but increasing additional government bureaucracy. And I, for one, don't want to see either a state government or a federal government get any more money than they need.
I didn't say anything about regulating marijuana. I would like it to be unregulated like practically everything else that we have right now. We have too much regulation in every area. I didn't say anything about regulating or taxing marijuana, but maybe Bill and I can join together on something. I agree with Bill that in the event somebody drives their motor vehicle after ingesting marijuana and they're unsafe, and that unsafe condition causes an accident, that's why we got Bill. And I'm not saying we should close down Bill's office. There's lots of real crime. That's fine if somebody does something to hurt another person. But is this second grade where we say, oh, somebody did something wrong with marijuana, therefore nobody can have marijuana? It's just ridiculous. And for whatever harm Bill could point out that actually ingesting the drug marijuana can cause, and maybe there is some somewhere, I don't know. I'm not aware of any of it anywhere. I've never had someone come into my office who was physically addicted, who couldn't stop or couldn't control themselves. But if there is harm from marijuana, it pales in comparison to the harm that is caused from the drug war. Don't make the mistake of equating whatever the harm is from the use of the drug to the harm that is caused to our entire nation, to all of us, the destruction of the Fourth Amendment. It doesn't take very long for you to just take a look at some of the cases that the United States Supreme Court has handed down, destroying your freedom and privacy, even for the people who want to keep marijuana illegal. It pales in comparison to the number of peaceful fellow human beings who are locked away in cages like animals right now. It's disgusting, it's immoral, it's un-American, and it should be ended for that reason alone.
Mr. Montgomery, final rebuttal.
So let's think about what the actual statistics are then for those who are incarcerated simply for marijuana possession. In Arizona is 131 state prison at the end of August of 2013. 131. That's 0.3% of that prison population. And given how we utilize plea bargains, that's probably pled down from possession of marijuana for sale or for trafficking. So in Arizona law, you can't go to prison for your first two possession offenses. There is an emphasis on treatment and substance abuse intervention and prevention. Why? Because marijuana is addictive. The PET scans are there. The studies are out now. There's a new one coming out every 6 to 8 weeks on the actual harm. There's a young man from Wyoming who went to Denver on spring break and ingested a marijuana edible cookie and then threw himself over the railing because he had a psychotic episode. It's documented. You can go look it up if you can get the keystrokes. Now, the other important point that you need to realize is that by creating the boogeyman called the drug war and trying to conflate that with Supreme Court cases is ignoring the fact that law enforcement would be just as likely to engage in other types of law enforcement operations that would have called for similar reviews. It doesn't matter if the substance within the apartment was a drug. It could have been a book for horse racing or something else over time. Criminals are very ingenious about trying to come up with other methods and means for committing their crimes. And what came first, the cop or the robber? You need to keep that in mind too. The drug war is not responsible for millions of people in prison. Nationally, 3.7% of people in prison are there for a possession-related offense, and it's not all marijuana. And for anybody here who would like to see our nation with greater heroin addiction, yeah, let's go ahead and stop what we've been trying to do with that too. But if we have a usage rate of less than 10%, drug policy has actually been successful. We've been able to maintain that over time. And our nation, our society, is better if fewer people are using drugs. They're more productive, they're more fun to be around, and they're not winding up on a corner and needing treatment, unable to work, slowly dying.
Mr. Montgomery, we'll start with you on your question. What difference do you see, if any, between America's experiment with alcohol prohibition in the 1920s and the marijuana prohibition of today?
Sure. Well, first off, the two legal regimes are very different. When the 18th Amendment was passed, it only prohibited the transportation, manufacture, and distribution of alcohol. It didn't say anything about the personal use or possession. Our drug laws today, as part of the overarching drug policy approach to it, also precludes possession and use. So it's much more comprehensive. There's also greater resources available today in order to try to interdict drug trafficking and drug sales than we had back then. Another important point to make too is this: we didn't have Alcoholics Anonymous until after Prohibition was repealed. Alcoholics Anonymous was founded in 1935. And since then there's been an ever-increasing rate of use for alcohol. Initially, at the beginning of Prohibition, alcohol use went down. There were fewer deaths from alcohol, and alcoholism rates went down too. So, in effect, Prohibition was doing its job at that point in time. The criminal organizations didn't go away. Violent crime didn't go away. They just mutated and went to other areas. Cartels won't go away. They'll just engage in other criminal activity. They're criminal organizations. They engage in crime. The fact that they're using drug crimes right now to generate their money doesn't mean they're going to go away. The mafia didn't go away. Al Capone's associates didn't go away. They went on to labor racketeering, extortion, gambling, prostitution. And I know what you then say, well, we should legalize all that too. You're right, if we legalized everything, there'd be no crimes, there'd be no criminals. But it also would be a society in which you wouldn't be able to leave your front door without a shotgun. And you'd have to stay up all night with a fire to keep the wolves at bay. So another big difference between Prohibition then and the drug policy we have in effect now is that the drug policy we have in effect now has been much more effective over time. And it's only the ranting and raving of those who don't quite understand what they're talking about are we continuing this debate. But it's time for a very sober and responsible citizenry to work hard to keep America the best country in the world.
Mr. Victor.
Well, you know, anybody here worried about the alcohol cartels? They're really scary, you know. One of them is called Budweiser. The other is called Miller. And you know, they can bring their horribly dangerous drugs now to the same exact street corner at the same exact time and place it on the shelf for people to peacefully purchase them. And there's no guns, and there's no violence, and there's no bullets. And in the event that they do get into a dispute, they come to a law firm, and they hire lawyers, and they go to court. But that's not a better system than what Bill is suggesting. Bill would rather maybe go back to the days of Prohibition. We're slow learners in our country. You would think that we have a perfect example, right? Perfect example from not that long ago of alcohol prohibition. A drug that may be, you know, dangerous drug. This drug is really bad. We got serious problems with alcohol. We had them then, we have them now. Although, in a legal environment, non-alcoholic beers have been going up. People can easily stop and get off alcohol if they choose, no problems. The market decides what people ingest. It's not the government. People used alcohol before Prohibition, people used it during Prohibition, and people used it after Prohibition. What's the difference? The black market is way different. And I've seen lots of stats, because I've researched that talked about alcoholism actually went up during Prohibition, not down. But the thing that Bill most is afraid of me saying, and so maybe he'll address it when he comes up here, is the fact that what's really different about this, at least the American people were astute enough to know that the federal government didn't have the authority in the Constitution under Article 1, Section 8 to run a prohibition on alcohol. So they had to pass an amendment. Where is the amendment for the federal government to run a big, giant, 69 billion annual cost marijuana drug war?
Mr. Montgomery.
It's a continuing disingenuous point to try to suggest that in making a decision about whether to legalize marijuana or drugs necessarily invites a review of the decision to legalize alcohol, or tobacco for that matter. We weren't there 7,000 years ago when Egyptians started to brew alcohol. There were no studies then to try to determine what the longitudinal effect would be upon individuals, families, communities, and societies if we were to legalize alcohol. By the time we became a nation, alcohol was in vogue. At the same time, though, public drunkenness was gravely frowned upon. And it was the fact that it was seen as shameful, that people didn't want to shame their families or be looked at in a shameful way when they went to church. The government didn't have to do much more than that. One of the other things to consider, too, is that in looking at the differences between prohibition and the effective drug policy that we have in place right now, is just that its effectiveness and the ability to control certain types of behavior or to influence certain types of behavior, and what we can do right now with respect to drugs. You know, the other thing to keep in mind too is we weren't around when people started cultivating and smoking tobacco to determine whether or not that should have been legal in the first place. We didn't have the studies in place to figure out that it was going to cause cancer and kill tens of thousands of people and cost us billions of dollars in health care. Marijuana has the same type of percentages that tobacco has. So why would we make that decision now when we actually have the benefit of having that kind of information up front? We shot ourselves at each foot with tobacco and alcohol, the next one goes to our head. And it makes absolutely no sense for us to do that when we are capable of looking at the data and assessing the impact. And Colorado is not a good picture. Things are not going well up there. It's only when you exclude a review of Denver and Denver County completely that you can make the claim that primaries have started in the fall, because it includes all of Colorado.
Mr. Victor, final rebuttal.
Herein lies some of the fundamental differences. Bill, in good faith, I think, and with good intentions, is trying to bring about what he has judged to be the best society. But a lot of people have done that through history. That's not what a free society is about. In a free society, you get to decide what's best for you, not Bill. The differences between the alcohol situation and the drug situation really aren't that spectacularly different. There are some differences. Alcohol's far worse. But here's one thing that's bothering me about the current state of affairs that I think we just ignore. We are the world's leader in incarceration rates. We lead the entire world. And I'm not talking about just raw numbers. Of course we do by raw numbers, but we also do as a percentage of our population. There is nothing to attribute that to other than the drug war. I was in the prison today talking to two inmates, and I asked them a question I like to ask all the time, which is, what percentage of people do you really think need to be here? I heard a number today that blew me away, 90%. Now, they're not all drug cases, but probably, Bill likes to say, well, you don't go for simple possession, but what Bill doesn't tell you is if you got 2 or 3 marijuana cigarettes, all of a sudden you're at risk of being charged with sales. If you have 1 prior felony conviction and you're charged almost anything, you're looking at mandatory prison. His very office is alleging priors. I'm going to tell you this, there are people in this audience right now whose kids are in prison for stupid little marijuana cases. I'm not going to name them or identify them. They know who they are. It's just simply not true that people don't go to prison. And so when you're talking about effectiveness, yeah, it's been effective at incarcerating our fellow peaceful American citizens, and I think that's an outrage.
Let's go around. Would the legalization of marijuana provide an economic boost within the state, and does the economic boost outweigh any detrimental effects on society as a whole?
There are no detrimental effects in society as a whole for increasing freedom, period. People choose to do things with their lives and their bodies that are detrimental to them, right? There are people in here who are overweight. Should I get excited and say, oh my God, obesity is a giant problem, we should make trans fats illegal? No. When you're talking about economic benefits, are you kidding me? I don't know anyone in Colorado, and I've done plenty of research on Colorado. From what I can see, they're pleased as punch with the situation in Colorado. I saw a chart where they were dividing up $200 million in new revenue that they were splitting out between schools and healthcare and this and that and the next thing. They're one of the largest new employers up there. This is a huge industry. It's always been a huge industry. I don't think the industry is one bit bigger now than it ever was. What's the difference? You know who's upset about this change? You know who's on Bill's side? The cartels, the drug dealers. They sit with Bill. I talk to them all the time. They do not like what's going on. I'm trying to put... We're back? All right, we're back. I'm trying to put the cartels out of business. You can't possibly understand the situation we're in unless you properly understand this is a huge underground market. I had some big-time drug dealers in my office not too long ago, and I said, hey, I understand the situation. Maybe you guys could come on my radio show and talk about it. And first they were worried about it because somebody might prosecute them, but I said, let's do it anonymously. They said, okay, I will come on and tell everybody on the air, Mark, that you are right. We hate what is going on. We're just trying to make a quick buck before we get out of business here. Why would you want to help the cartels?
Not even figured. You have to keep in mind that when we talk about freedom, what our Constitution was about, it was not a Constitution written for an amorphous, free country drifting about somewhere, theoretically. It was written for the United States of America. And there are particular conditions and circumstances at the time of that founding where the freedoms that were established were meant for specific things. The right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But when you confuse the means for the end, you put yourself in a position where you can make some of these arguments. The idea that we would somehow benefit economically enough to overcome the societal costs is a fool's errand. We can see already with the revenues generated from alcohol and tobacco in FY 2014 that they were just less than $400 million. Alcohol-related crashes alone, according to the 2014 report by the Arizona Department of Transportation, was almost $500 million alone. And that's before we start factoring in all the healthcare costs related to addiction from tobacco and from alcohol. And it bears underscoring, too, that even when you attempt to try to create a legal market for marijuana, the cartels don't give up. If they can't compete, they take over the distribution and the sales. And that's what happened in Colorado. In fact, within Denver, shortly after it passed, there was a raid on several of the recreational facilities, and a cartel from Colombia was involved. Well, but wait a minute, Colombia was known for cocaine until they saw a burgeoning market for marijuana, too. They're adaptable as criminal organizations, and that's what they're going to continue to do. And it bears noting, too, that our incarceration rates are also affected by those who are detained for immigration deportation. That's a significant contributing factor that has nothing to do with someone's possession of drugs. The other thing, too, is our jail population. It's treated as a static number instead of the rotating number that it is. And that's where you get to saying the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate.
We also have 7 million people on probation in our country. We are out of control. We're building private prisons at a rate that surpasses every other nation. We are a total police state. I mean, I don't know that there's any other way to say that right now. And a lot of this is attributed to the drug war, because when the police can stop you, when they can take Fluffy the dog out and say Fluffy the dog has alerted I say he's alerted because the alert could be almost anything. That effectively deletes your Fourth Amendment rights, all in pursuit of this same thing that's been around just as long as alcohol. I don't know, Bill made the case that maybe alcohol's been around a long time. I don't think that weed came along in, say, the Bush administration or something like that. When you talk about societal costs, there are two halves to this. One half is the savings. The savings is almost incalculable. I mean, when I said $69 billion, that was an old figure that's the last time I looked at the figure. That's what we're spending on the drug war. Then the cost, in human cost, to put people in prison, to break the backs of our fellow humans, to take them out of their family situations and leave the wives and the kids suffering on welfare and on access. You realize what the costs are there? What about the cost of this giant law enforcement machine? Have you seen Sheriff Joe Arpaio's tank that sits outside in front of his jail that says war on drugs in it? Who's he using that tank against? Look, cartels, they don't just disappear the second it becomes legal. And it's still quasi-legal even in Colorado. They don't have all-out do whatever you want with your own body there yet. But cartels don't just disappear. Even the cartel guys I was talking with, they want to make a few extra bucks before they're out of business. But use your own brain on this. Think about where the alcohol cartels are. Do you really think that these flunkies who are cartel guys from Mexico can compete with the likes of Philip Morris or our big multinational corporations growing and transporting and selling marijuana? They know they're going to be out of business, and so do we.
Mr. Montgomery, final rebuttal.
The human cost that we would wind up seeing would be for future generations of Americans who aren't able to compete, whose IQs have dropped by an average of 8 points due to chronic marijuana use, who've seen earlier onset for bipolar, schizophrenia, clinical depression, suicide, whose brains are now affected permanently with the brain chemistry as well as its physical layout. They no longer have the right number of reward centers to motivate them to work hard to seek employment. Why would we deliberately try to undermine future generations of Americans at a time when we need to compete more in a global economy? We will wind up paying more in the future. And to have just one other American become addicted to marijuana, and 80% of those who are in addiction treatment in Colorado will tell you that they started off with marijuana. Chris Hennis, Boston Celtic, wound up in the last 5 to 6 years of his NBA career addicted to heroin. When asked what role did marijuana play in his addiction, replied that the first page in every addict's story starts with marijuana. When you look at the percentages of drugs used in the last year, always the highest number is marijuana because it is seen as somewhat benign. We've got teens now who think that smoking marijuana 2 times a day is less risky than smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. It's ridiculous. And it's because they're getting an inconsistent message. And the objective data does not support the continued asinine assertion that marijuana is harmless. This is not your Woodstock pot. It's gone from THC concentrations of 3 to 5% to upwards of 20% and even 30% in Colorado. Creating hash oil leads to concentrations of as much as 90%, which can lead to addiction and even death.
Mr. Montgomery, let's start with you on the question. If marijuana is legalized, should it be regulated by state or federal authorities, or should it be regulated at all?
Well, starting with the premise that I don't think it's going to be legalized, but that if it were, there should be an effort to try and regulate it like other controlled substances in order to continue to try to the best that we could, even though we would follow the same rate as we have with alcohol or tobacco to limit access to youth. But even then, we're failing. So with our medical marijuana program, youth are increasingly getting their marijuana from those with a medical marijuana card. So I think we're going to try to seek some degree of regulation. The principle of subsidiarity would say the lowest level of government would be best. Again, I don't want to see the federal government get one more dollar. I'm tired of President Obama's good ideas. We wind up paying more for it in the long run. And I don't want the federal government to grow any more than absolutely necessary. But I also think it's perverse to think that we would take a substance, money from a substance, and use it for education when we see increasing numbers of students who are being expelled and suspended because of marijuana use and their inability to compete, their inability to learn because of the effect on short-term memory. Those are the objective facts. You ignore them at your peril. Last point I got to make is Sheriff Joe does not have a tank. A tank has treads, a turret, a cannon. It has none of that. And I keep telling him that. One of these days the sheriff will get it.
Mr. Victor,
I hope the sheriff didn't hear that comment because he'll rush right up. Boy, I'd sure rather my kids smoke marijuana than smoke tobacco cigarettes. Tobacco cigarettes, we know are addictive, we know what they do, and there's lots of objective data on that. But look, when you talk about regulation here, I'm not a fan of regulation, but we're not going to get our country back until the regulation starts coming from the parents. The parents need to start regulating things, not the damn government. And it doesn't matter whether it's the ridiculously inefficient backward federal government or the ridiculous inefficient backward state government. Parents need to start being parents again. I don't understand why this is so hard. We cannot make the government the substitute parent. You can make any rules you want, right? Just like no alcohol until you're 21. Did anybody in here comply with that? Maybe there's one or two, I don't know. But the government doesn't decide this stuff. The government is a horrible parent. And the reasons we're having the problems we're having in our country is because the collective we've been horrible parents. We need to say, look, enough with the government running everything, enough with the government regulating everything. If marijuana became legal tomorrow, that doesn't mean that I can't tell my 5 kids exactly what they can do with their bodies while they're minors, right? My job is to try to teach them how to act responsibly in a free society. Not to say go read some statute that Bill Montgomery and a bunch of people in the legislature have come up with. They don't care about that unless and until we can start instilling some self-regulation into our children. We won't have a real free country, and we won't deserve a real free country.
Mr. Montgomery.
You know, the kind of regulation we would wind up seeing, and Mark mentioned Philip Morris earlier, would take on the same kind of regulation, the same kind of commercial environment we saw with big tobacco. We'd wind up with big marijuana. In fact, we're seeing some of the same practices by marijuana companies in Colorado that the tobacco companies engaged in back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, back when they knew that tobacco would kill. And they're starting some of the same things now. They know now what marijuana will do. And they're trying to get kids hooked now through the edibles. One of the first things they tried to do after marijuana was recreationalized was lower the age from 21 to 18. Why? Because you got to get the kids hooked in order for you to get your customer base over time. And it would just be an absolute travesty. It would be another stain on this nation's soul if it took us another 30, 40, 50 years to realize that mistake when we have the ability to forestall it up front. I do agree with one aspect that Mark mentioned, and so I want to highlight it. We do have to be better parents. So I want to know why you want to make my job harder by sending the wrong message that drug use is okay if you choose to do it. It makes no sense to know intuitively and internally that using drugs is going to screw up your ability to do what you're supposed to do as a human being, and then damn somebody else's kid or damn somebody else down the street in complete disregard for what we'll do to them. And say, but if you want to go ahead and screw up your life, go ahead and do it. It's really looking out for your neighbor. This lure, too, of saying you can have more freedom if you legalize drugs reminds me of this story in a garden. It started off with a promise that you can eat this apple and nothing bad will occur.
Mr. Victor, final rebuttal.
I don't have any stories about talking snakes to deliver right now, unfortunately. I'm interested in talking parents, okay? Look, I don't drink any alcohol at all, and that's by my choice. That's because I'm a big boy, I'm a competent adult, and I'm responsible for my body. But I would be the first person to stand up and argue that alcohol ought to be legal for consenting adults. I don't want that choice taken away from me, even though it's a choice I personally don't choose. I want the dignity of making that decision for myself. I don't want the government sending me messages. I don't want the government sending my children messages. I'm in charge of doing the parenting for my kids. Couple of quick stories. My son Braden's all excited because he got his permit now where he can drive a car. Does he get to drive with me? No. When he gets his license, he knows he's eligible to start driving with me. Just because the government, my kids would never make an argument to me and say, hey Dad, the government says it's okay for me to drive a car, therefore I get to drive, right? I would say, I don't care what the government says. I'm the parent. I decide when you get to drive a car, not the government. That's what I'm instilling in my kids. When that same boy, Braden, was about 5 years old, I think he heard us talking about alcohol. Heck, we had a big, huge open bar in our house, not for us, but for our friends who might choose to use some alcohol. He was curious about what alcohol tasted like. Did I say you gotta wait? The government says you gotta wait till 21 before you can try this? No. We make the decisions in our house because we're the parents. And I said, why don't you try some of this Jack Daniels? And I poured it in his little sippy cup or whatever juice cup he had, and he chugged it right down. And that's how I got my son to learn that alcohol may not be so wonderful after all. Let's let parents make parenting decisions and not worry about sending government messages.
I'll start with you. I think in a roundabout way we've hit on this question, but we're going to ask it nevertheless and allow for some banter to go on here. Mr. Vicker, generally marijuana has some of the same psychological effects as alcohol and tobacco, yet alcohol and tobacco are illegal. How should we treat marijuana, tobacco, and alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana so as to ensure consistency in our laws?
Well, I would like to deregulate all of it. I don't think that we ought to, just because we're over-regulating alcohol. I thought it was kind of ridiculous when I joined the United States Marine Corps at 17 and 2 weeks, and then I was ordered to go overseas in Desert Storm, and I sat in a hole right by the border, and I was ordered to take anthrax pills and nerve agent pills, and I was trained as a marksman with an AR-15, and our job was to breach the minefields that when I came home, the government decided I couldn't drink a beer. That seems screwed up to me. I don't think that any of this, none of it, is the role of government. All of it is the role of parents. And if corporations want to take policies and say, we don't sell to this group or that group, that's their prerogative. They can make those decisions. We need to get away from everything government all the time. And shame on us for calling ourselves a free society. We live in the empire with more rules and regulations. I can tell you as a criminal defense lawyer, I don't even know all the crimes that a person in Arizona could be charged with. So, I don't think we should be regulating any of this stuff. And if competent adults choose to alter their consciousness just for the fun of it, that is their decision. I'm sure they can do that in a way that's peaceful. They can do that in a way that doesn't cause risk of accidents. It's called use an Uber, or have somebody else drive, or just stay home. Competent adults can figure out things to do with their body, and frankly, I don't care what drug they're putting in their body in a legal sense. In a moral sense, I might try to convince a friend of mine maybe they shouldn't use methamphetamine or something, but I don't get to make that decision for another competent adult.
Mr. Montgomery.
Well, I would actually challenge some of the premise too, that the effects of marijuana are the same as alcohol and tobacco, because they're not. If you get drunk on alcohol one night and you wake up the next morning, you're going to have your hangover, and by that second day, there aren't going to be much lingering effects at all. But after your use of marijuana, there will be. After you smoke one cigarette, you may have that immediate nicotine rush, but that's going to wear off too. That marijuana cigarette is going to increase your heart rate for at least 4, maybe 6 hours. It can extend beyond the time the nicotine is going to affect your system. So it's not really the same. And continue to discuss too what the role of parents are in having general deterrent effects on conduct that is not contributory to a good society. Again, you've got to understand the purpose of why we have the United States in the first place. It's not an amorphous, quote-unquote, free society. It's the United States of America in which there were specific ideas and attitudes about how we were supposed to regulate ourselves and live together in society. And over the last 30, 40 years, we've done a really good job at undermining the very institutions that used to teach that kind of personal responsibility. Churches, schools, and the family. And to have us as society then, the other thing to keep in mind, it's not this us versus them kind of thing. When we continue to try to create this divide between government that's made up of people who live down the street from us and who come from the same neighborhoods, you create an artificial construct in society's psyche that somehow we can do what we want to do, and that it's separate and apart from what we have created to govern ourselves as a society with a particular purpose. Again, true freedom in life is not doing whatever you want to do, it's doing what you need to do to be the best human being you can be.
Mr. Victor, before you answer or go your final rebuttal, I just want to make an announcement. So we want to open it up after this final rebuttal with both Mr. Victor and Mr. Montgomery. We want to open it up to questions. If you have a question, we'd ask that you line up over here. And what we'd like to do is this. We want to have, I'm sure most of you have a position on this. You're either pro-legalization or you're anti-legalization. We'd like to alternate, right? So not everyone's going after Mr. Victor, everyone's going after Montgomery. So we want to alternate, and we'd ask that you get right to the question, no long drawn-out narratives. So with that, Mr. Victor, final rebuttal here.
I gotta say, it's, to me, and I'm sure to a lot of people here, it's kind of excruciating to listen to Bill talk about the effects of marijuana, because he clearly doesn't know. And I wish that he would just go smoke a joint. I really do, because so much of this stuff doesn't make any sense to me or anybody else who's ever engaged in that activity. I mean, is it okay for us to say this as Americans, right? Even Ted Cruz is now on record saying, yeah, I smoked a joint. So did all of these presidents, right? And somehow they didn't manage to ruin their lives. They became presidents of the United States. They became leaders in business, right? Does anybody think Steve Jobs never smoked a joint? I mean, come on. To try to say that people are going to smoke marijuana and ruin their lives is just patently ridiculous. Maybe some people will, but that's what a free society is about. And we can do our best to try to help them if they're smoking marijuana and they get out of control or something like that. But this isn't really a pro-marijuana position. This is a pro-freedom position. As I said at the beginning, marijuana is just one little tiny piece of the puzzle about you being in charge of your life. And I don't see it. We just went through this big thing about gay marriage. Really, we had it. That just happened. We knew it was going to happen. We shouldn't really care about that. It's other people's business. Why can't we say the same thing about marijuana? Why can't we take the same position and say, look, if other competent adults want to smoke a joint and they're not doing anything to endanger, I'm not worried about whether they're the best human being they can be or not. They will be the human being that they decided to be. Don't they have that right?
Mr. Montgomery, final rebuttal here.
In the United States of America, we sought to come together and to declare independence from Britain because we wanted to have a degree of freedom that included the freedom to worship and the freedom to then become the creatures that God created us to be. And it was not a disconnected idea of freedom that everybody would be able to do whatever the hell they wanted to do on any given day at any given time. No, that is not freedom. You're just trading one form of slavery for another. That slavery happens to be marijuana addiction or heroin addiction or any other drug addiction, let alone alcohol or tobacco addiction. You're not being the best human being you can be. And you're a drag on this country, and you're a drag on our community. And future generations of Americans are the ones that are going to pay the price for that. Who benefits? Who benefits from greater Americans smoking marijuana and becoming addicted? Who benefits from a greater number of Americans who would then become addicted to heroin? We do not benefit at all, and ignorance is no excuse. The responsible position for us to take as a society is to encourage others and to encourage the pursuits of those things that will bring about true happiness and that aren't a measure of a lie and aren't just one more failed effort to try to create a society that cannot exist and cannot sustain itself. The sober, reflective position would be for us to maintain the status quo as it is right now, with the exception of the ridiculous experiment in medicalization. There is a process in place, and I favor it, to provide the necessary testing to reschedule marijuana where appropriate, just like we do with cocaine or with opium. But we didn't legalize cocaine just because we had lidocaine or novocaine. We didn't legalize opium just because we had morphine. There's a responsible approach to that. We can do that with this too. We can be responsible adults and responsible Americans.
Darrell, what time do we need to close out? 8:30, okay, because we're going to have closing arguments as well, 2 minutes each. So both Mr. Montgomery and Mr. Vick will have 2 minutes each for each question that's thrown their way. Mr. Weiss, or?
Mr. Montgomery, you used Greek philosophers as examples of paragons of virtue when you were condemning moral relativism. Yet those same philosophers that you referenced, practiced pederasty, drunkenness. Cannabis was already in use in Asia Minor at that time. So I'm wondering, which parts of those philosophers is it that you're using for your moral relativism?
I'm not going to answer a ridiculous question like that. You just had your 15 seconds to think.
Mr. Victor, would you like to respond to that? Okay. Okay.
Mr. Montgomery, thank you for your service. I'm a Vietnam veteran myself. Today is a special day for me. I will ask you questions, be more of a statement or anything. 48 years ago today, I had the honor and privilege of commissioning a United States destroyer called the USS Sample. And we used to tell people that we were the best that the United States had to offer. And today I was also honored in Sun City. We're doing marijuana education. And I was honored to share a sample of the best medication on this planet for the elderly. We've seen results. And with all due respect, sir, your name-calling potheads, it offends me. A lot of name-calling offends me. When we came home, we were all baby killers. All the boys coming home now are heroes. And you know the truth of war, we're both. We're both. And it's a lot to deal with. And I'd like to spend some time with you sometime. And the name you're going to call me right now is Healthy. I've been a patient for 4 years. I've got all my prescription drugs. I've got the doctor's report to prove it. And I'd love for you to join us Monday from noon to 2, Coco's in Sun City. And we'll educate you. I feel sorry for you. You've been deceived.
Between medicinal applications and recreational use. Well, then you're violating the law. And I have no respect for you. And I have no respect for you as someone who would try to claim that you served this country and took an oath to uphold the Constitution and defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic, because you're an enemy.
Mr. Victor?
I think that he is probably representative of a large segment of the population, and I think it's really sad. I think that this right here is a great American who owns his body, who served his country. The only argument here is that he should have any concern whatsoever in terms of what he does with his body in his backyard. And therein lies the shame of what's going on in America right now. And I want to just reiterate, I think that people on the other side of this argument, I think many of them are acting with good intentions. I know Bill personally, we have lunch together, and I know, first of all, Bill and I agree on far more than we disagree on. And I believe him to be a good American, but we see this issue differently, and we need to keep it as an intellectual discussion. And for this gentleman back here, this is why this is such an urgent matter, and we need to get, because he could go to jail over something like this, and to me that's just such a disgrace on our country.
Possessing marijuana, you have to have in your possession a usable amount of marijuana. And it's not just simply, no one can come up and say, you look like a marijuana user, I'm going to make an arrest. There has to be the evidence there. And it's not enough simply for someone to hold out their hands and say, I'm a recreational user, arrest me. It doesn't work that way. Plus, I don't have the power to arrest. But that's exactly how the corpus delicti rule works. It's not just simply your statement that you have committed a crime. There has to actually be evidence of that crime independent of the statement alone.
I completely agree.
Okay, my question's for Mr. Montgomery. My name is Eric Johnson. I'm currently members of the Phoenix Cannabis Coalition and the Healing Phoenix. It's an outreach for the gay and lesbian community. Currently there is over 65,000 sick medical marijuana patients in Arizona. Based on the verbiage outlined in ARS 36-2802, it states that it is illegal for a patient to engage in smoking marijuana in any public place. With that being said, my question to you, Mr. Montgomery, is why did your office, the Maricopa County Attorneys, deny the request to provide access to a safe and private medicating area for medical marijuana patients for the Phoenix Pride Parade? This was intended to be a private area that was only accessible to patients that had a valid medical marijuana card, preventing unauthorized access to non-patients, which making this private. Currently, it's a 2-day festival, and each day gets about 100 degrees outside. And we cannot come in and out of re-entry. Once we leave, the 65,006 patients, if they try to medicate because of no public space, they are subject to arrest. And we're talking about the HIV community and the GLBTQ community. Can you please answer why you denied me the request?
We don't make zoning decisions.
It's not zoning. Phoenix Pride told me it was not zoning. Phoenix Pride officials gave me the okay, and per law.
Sir, my office is not involved in those decisions. That has to deal with permitting or zoning.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, I was told that the decision came from your office.
Just like the people who told you about marijuana lied, they lied to you here.
Mr. Victor, any response?
My question is regarding if we keep marijuana illegal, what would you, Mr. Montgomery, plan on doing as far as the government goes to stop people from using it? Would you go the more preventative education approach? And then if it's continued to be used, would you go as far as some countries do, is they actually give the death penalty for drug traffickers? Yeah, but say, well, like, because you want to try to prevent people from doing it, so
Right, well, and so we would be able to continue to do what we're doing right now, which is to offer diversion, deferred prosecution for people to be able to go through substance treatment programs. Under Arizona law right now, the first 2 possession or use offenses, you can't go to prison. And my office, along with other prosecutors, actually petitioned the legislature to change the diversion statute to allow us to offer diversion to somebody, even if they had a prior felony conviction, so that we can continue to offer those services. That's what the office policy is, and we try to pursue those treatment options whenever. I don't pass the laws, it's the legislature. I mean, let's be serious. I'm not going to go down there and ask for the death penalty for using marijuana. Come on.
Mr. Rick, next question.
I'm glad you said that, Bill Montgomery. My question's for you. In the last couple years, I personally know people that, I know a woman who was ripped out of her shower, butt naked, and left to sit on her stairs while police raided her home. I know 4 children that had guns pointed at them by big military police officers for 4 hours while police raided their homes. I know people that have had their animals shot. And most of these people I'm talking about they were legal patients and caregivers at the time of these horrible things that have happened to them, but because of this drug war, these horrible things have happened. I know a disabled veteran that was working at a clinic when the drug war came in there, and he was guns at face, denied being able to get help up while he was being demanded with a gun to get up, but he could not get up by himself. These are the horrible things that happen because of this war on this plant. My question, and also just to let you know, my uncle, a Vietnam Purple Heart veteran, was killed terribly in front of my 4-year-old baby cousin over 12 marijuana plants. So my question for you is, do you seriously believe that this plant is that dangerous to continue treating the people this way? And then the second part of my question that I added to after one of your last questions, and do you, our county attorney, seriously believe that cigarette smoking and alcohol consumption only suffer short-term YNU side effects like marijuana does? So, 2, is this necessary treatment for this? 1, is this really necessary treatment over this plant? Do you really feel it's that dangerous? And the other part 2, do you really believe what you said, that alcohol and cigarette consumption only suffers short-term side effects like marijuana? Is that really where your education has taken you?
No, I don't believe any of it. I was just saying it for the debate. And as far as all the parade of horribles, I've been in a house rather than just know people when a sheriff's department has served a warrant to arrest someone engaged in drug trafficking. Now, I was the one who was home that day when my father was a federal fugitive because he engaged in drug trafficking. So I don't need to hear anecdotal statements. I need to. It was marijuana too. So I know from firsthand experience exactly what that can look like. And simple possession doesn't usually result in any of that. But it's the additional crimes. Now, I'm sure they're all your friends, so they weren't engaged in anything else. I'm sure of it. But should we keep the laws that we have in place right now? Absolutely. Should they be prosecuted to the extent that we do them? I just explained to you how we do that. And given what the impact is to communities that we're seeing in Colorado and Washington and elsewhere, yeah, I really believe we ought to continue to do that. And I've seen the studies myself. They've been peer-reviewed. You can find them on PubMed.gov that'll talk about the differences and effects on the brain, the chemistry, the bronchial system, and the heart from marijuana use versus alcohol and smoking. And when you've had the chance to sit down and read it and see and compare, then you may be able to remember more about the distinctions that I made there too.
Mr. Victor.
There are lots of studies about detrimental effects from saturated fat and sugar in our diet that I think wreak far more havoc on the human body than does marijuana. This isn't about whether it's good for you or bad for you. It's about freedom. And I want to first commend you for for standing here and asking the question that you did. Good for you that you're able to get up here and confront the county attorney. But I will say this, 21 years of being a criminal defense lawyer, I have heard more horror stories over police officers barging in, smashing front doors down, looking for that evil green plant. And it's always sad for me when people come in and they sit on the other side of my desk and they say, well, I didn't realize that things were like this. Well, they are like this. The drug war has created more violence in our society probably than anything else. It is probably the single most detrimental decision our country has ever engaged in, possibly with the exception of some of the crazy wars we've run, but maybe not, because we are now saddled with a law. Our criminal procedure has now been warped. Our Constitution has had big holes blown through it now, all in the pursuit of the evil green weed. And as I've said, the actual mechanisms of the drug war have caused far more harm, way in excess of any harm that all of the illegal drugs put together could possibly cause, which, by the way, is about 1% when stacked up against the 99% of other prescription drugs that kills other people from things like saturated fat and sugar.
Mr. Montgomery, you mentioned that you feel that the status quo is far better than laws that we could enact legalizing marijuana. Would you mind explaining to us all of the great victories that you have had in stopping marijuana in this area? Single-handedly winning the drug war? I'd like to hear you explain that, because my son was involved in growing marijuana under the Medical Marijuana Act, and he had both a license to grow and a license to be a caregiver. And when one of your undercover detectives called him and said that he had a card and that he wanted to get some marijuana to try out, and he would donate to the cost of it, you put him in prison for 3.5 years. And he tells me that half of the people in his pod at the Arizona State Prison in Yuma are there because of drug problems.
Seriously? You want to answer such an asinine question like how I single-handedly fought the drug war? That's ridiculous. Made absolutely no claim to that and stood up here and told you I started off my position, not as the county attorney, but as a fellow American. If you want to be that ignorant and continue to wail away against your perceived issues with authority, you can do that. But that's not the conversation that I was having here. And it's amazing how many people know somebody who in turn knows 100 people who were unjustly prosecuted and imprisoned. Funny how that always works out, because whenever I ask for the information and the data, it never proves true. And if your son engaged in that, I'm sure he told you he didn't do anything wrong, because that's what criminals say all the time.
Mr. Victor?
Why is it then that...
Well, of course, there's nothing that Bill could possibly say in response to that, because there is nothing anybody can say in response to that, because there's no hope of ever winning the drug war. Nobody believes the drug war will ever be won. Nobody thinks that the flow of drugs will be even slowed. I do lots of federal cases, and I get lots of occasions to talk to DEA agents. All they do is fight the drug war. And I always ask them the same question: how we doing? We close to winning? You going to stop any flow of drugs anywhere, anytime soon? And they just laugh. They say to me, oh, it's a job. They all know what they're doing is spinning their wheels, because there's a lot of demand and there's a lot of supply, and the market has always been and will always continue to be stronger than the government rules. And so good, peaceful, wonderful people are in our prison system right now that should be there. And it's, to me, one of the largest moral outrages we have in our country. Right now, that man's son is sitting in a cage like an animal over a marijuana case. And so anybody who's talking about whatever perceived harm there is from smoking marijuana ought to look at the real harm going on from this stupid damn drug war that is going to end soon.
This is a question kind of going off of the previous comment, a short practical question for Mr. Montgomery. If marijuana will be in circulation inevitably, wouldn't it be better to legalize and regulate so that THC would be able to be maintained at safer levels for public safety?
We cannot legalize it at the state level without still violating federal law. We can't do it. The people of Arizona have no more authority to violate the supremacy clause of the Constitution than the state legislature would. And so it's somewhat of a disingenuous line to begin from to presume that we could do it at that point in time. There is a process for reviewing the availability of marijuana at the federal level, and that's to go through the Controlled Substances Act. And there have been components of marijuana that have been made available through medicinal applications and rescheduled to Schedule 2. But that's the proper way to follow it, and that's the proper policy approach. And again, if people want to throw up their hands and surrender the effort that we've undertaken for effective drug policy for the last several decades, you can do that. But you're going to do that if you want to, based upon accurate information. Over 50% of Americans are using alcohol. Over 25% are using tobacco. Less than 10% are using drugs. That's success. Identify any other area where there's regular conduct by Americans and people are trying to tell them not to do it, whether it's saturated fats, trans fats, or what have you, and keep it below 10%. And you can create the boogeyman called the drug war all day long and rail against it. But if at the end of the day less than 10% of Americans are engaging in self-destructive behavior, it's a good thing. Increasing its availability for someone like you or your friends to then have to face when you're going into college, it's irresponsible for any adult to not want to help you become the human being you were created to be. I won't be a conspirator to it. Thank you for asking such a good question, a very respectful way that allowed me to respond.
Hi, good question. Just commenting on Bill's answer for a moment, I wonder what Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, and even Alexander Hamilton would think about what Bill just said, that the states can't legalize marijuana because the federal government is basically running this drug war. First off, I don't agree with that. I think we've already gone way beyond what the feds have allowed, and the courts have allowed it, and that's the case. And the feds can still do whatever they want. I would certainly argue we can completely legalize marijuana on the state level, and if the feds want to enforce their laws, they can. But what we can do is stop putting people in prison in the state courts just because someone's violating the law. But what would they think about this power of the federal government that's not even enumerated in our Constitution? For those of you who will recall, our federal government is supposed to be about very strictly limited powers, and they're laid out. Congress's powers are in Article 1, Section 8. Section 8. And nowhere in there does it say or remotely provide any kind of authority for this drug war. You know where they get this crazy? Does anybody ever wonder how the federal government gets to run the drug war? They get to hang it on the Interstate Commerce Clause, their ability to regulate commerce among the several states. That's how we got into this huge criminal drug war. So I just think that the comment that the states couldn't legalize it because the federal government would never allow it is just ridiculous, and we ought to try it, and I think we will.
I just want to thank you both for coming. It was a very fiery debate, and I appreciate that you remained intellectual on it. You didn't really go party or ideological. So my question is for Bill Montgomery, but I think I'm going to broaden it at the end so you can be included as well. Healthcare right now is a cartel. Our high prices for unhealthy choices are inflated by fixed prices because we have a monopoly on it. So my question is, what is to be deemed now as unhealthy and healthy, and should we prohibit stuff that are unhealthy choices? And then also, just like genetically modified foods and many climate change and all these other things that have inconclusive scientific claims like marijuana, should we regulate it based on little evidence?
Mr. Montgomery, we're going to try and get through all these questions, so if we could limit the answers to 1 minute from here on out, that would be great if we get to the rest of these folks.
Sure, and I've got a hard time at 8:30, but I'm going to have to leave too. Real quick then, I would actually turn the question around and you say there's such scheme evidence of the benefits of marijuana as an overall legalized substance that until you can show me it really wouldn't be more harmful than alcohol or tobacco, don't attempt to legalize it. And I would also, for purposes of our discussion, Mark, I would also distinguish legalization from decriminalization. Decriminalization, certainly the states could do. But legalization, where there's an affirmative plan for allowing people to use it, that's where I say it runs afoul of the supremacy clause.
I'd still love to try it, and I think we will. And I think the federal government will back down, as they have thus far. And the reason they're going to back down is because the only thing that matters in all of this is what's in the hearts and minds of the people in this nation. And those hearts and minds have changed, and they will continue to change, just like the hearts and minds of the people in all the other countries that surround us. Other countries have flat out legalized everything. In Europe, almost everything's been decriminalized at this point. You can go to Amsterdam, you can buy marijuana legally for recreational purposes all over the place. And I've been there 4 times, and there ain't no problem with it. It's peacefully bought and peacefully sold, and it will be here as well. So with that said, we find the same exact problem with the Obamacare situation as we're finding here. If you don't like Obamacare because you think that maybe now the government is going to be running it and we can now prohibit unhealthy behavior, which is exactly the next step of the argument, then I would say, who the heck are you to tell someone else that they cannot put something into their body, even if it's harmful?
My name's Chuck Hatt. I would like to know, what was the problem in 1937 that was solved by criminalizing marijuana? What problem was solved? Either one.
I wasn't there then. Hell if I
You weren't around.
No, problems were only created by criminalizing marijuana. It was a ridiculous decision. I don't think our founders ever intended that this would have happened. However, there is an interesting story about something that happened in 1937 that I'm not going to get into that deals with how the Supreme Court did constitutional law decision making.
Okay, my question is for both of you. Presuming that Mark were right and that marijuana were decriminalized or legalized, how do you feel that the laws of deregulation would be, let me rephrase it. What do you feel would be the difference between rules for something such as requiring the use of a car seat or using seat belts or monitoring GMOs or any of the other things that we regulate? How would that be any different than having some regulation as far as an age? Both of you.
I think as a society, okay, if we decide that we want to be a free society, we need to have some foundational principles. And those principles ought to start with the basic concept that you are in charge of you in your jurisdiction. That's your body, your money, your time, your property. I, on the other hand, I'm in charge of me. I don't get to stand here like Bill did and say, look, until you can show me that there's some beneficial effect that outweighs the harmful effect of this and that. I don't say that because I don't think you got to convince me of anything to use your own body. That to me sounds un-American. It doesn't sound compatible with a free society. So I would want all laws consistent with that notion. Until you show me force, fraud, some kind of trespass, or at least a huge risk of an imminent trespass, I don't think it's anybody's business. And I certainly don't think it's the government's business to get involved. Keep in mind, this has nothing to do with whether or not citizens can talk to each other about what's right or what's wrong. I'm not saying you get to do anything you want, as Bill keeps trying to present. I'm saying you get to do anything you want with your body, not with somebody else's body. When I tell you you can't put something in your body, I'm trying to do something with your body. And I'm offended that the government would even ask me to get involved and sort of be a co-conspirator with trying to take control of another competent adult's body.
So the reason why I made that point about you need to convince me is because in a policy debate, if you want to change current policy, you have the burden of persuasion to convince me and anybody else why that change would be good. That's how policy debates work. You don't assume your position is right and then try to argue from it. That's why I mentioned that that's what we have right now is the status quo. Currently, marijuana is illegal, with in Arizona certain very narrow exceptions with respect to Arizona's Medical Marijuana Act. If you want to expand that, you need to make the argument and be persuasive. And in doing so, everybody also needs to keep in mind that the debate on marijuana itself has been influenced over the last 20 years by $150 million pumped into the argument, 120 or so from George Soros himself, who's made his money when societies fail. Why is he betting on us to fail? I don't want him to win.
Okay, we're gonna go right into closing arguments. Mr. Montgomery, you go first. Mr. Victor, you'll have the last word.
Enjoy that, because as a criminal defense attorney, you never get it. At the end of the day, in order to fairly approach this particular issue and address it in a responsible way, we've got to understand the concepts of freedom and what it is that we're actually being asked to consider. And in reviewing, going all the way back to philosophers who began to answer the question about what is it to be a good human being, a debate and an exercise that informed later generations of political philosophers upon whom our founding fathers relied in forging those founding documents. To be a good human being is to engage in those activities and pursuits, that pursuit of happiness that makes us a better human being. And together, as Americans, we seek to fashion a society which will continue to be a shining city upon a hill and continues to be an example in which the freedom we enjoy, the liberty we pursue, is that which helps us to be the best human being possible. So if you want to legalize any drug, you need to make the argument that doing so will make us better human beings. Instead of just generalized arguments that maximizing freedom means you can't tell me I can't do anything. Even if you want to invoke the harm principle and say that there's even a limit to that, where as long as I'm not harming anybody else, you still have to, in this particular instance, exaggerate autonomy and assume that you actually could engage in that kind of conduct without necessarily interacting with, interfering with, and affecting other people. Everyone who's ever lived in a home with an alcoholic knows that's not true. Everyone who's ever watched a loved one die from lung cancer knows that those personal decisions didn't affect just them. And that's the reality of this. We have an obligation to present and future generations of Americans not to set up a society in which they then become burdened by foolish, short-sighted decisions now. And we have a responsibility to those who have fought and died in the past to preserve the freedom that we enjoy as Americans and preserve the society we have.
Mr. Victor, the final word.
It's nice to have the final word for one. You know, Bill has this idea of what a better human being is. I think that might be open for debate. I don't know what a better human being is. Isn't that the fundamental problem here? I mean, if we could all agree on what a better human being was, then we could certainly try to move in that direction. But we don't agree on what a better human being is. We all have different ideas about that. That's what a free society is about. I got an option to decide what a better human being is for me, and I might change my mind in 6 months or 6 years or 6 minutes. That's the responsibility of being a free human. All of you have that right to decide for yourselves what a better human being is, and it may include smoking a joint once in a while. That's up to you, and it may not. But you have a right to make that decision. A great law professor of mine once told me while I was in law school, Mark, if they get you asking the wrong question, it doesn't matter what the answer is. And we've been talking a lot about the wrong question here. The wrong question is marijuana healthy or unhealthy? Does it have bad effects or not? There's lots of things that are legal and ought to be legal that have unhealthy, bad effects. That's not the right question. The right question is, who gets to decide whether this particular substance gets to go into your body? Isn't the answer obvious? Why on earth shouldn't you, assuming you are a competent, free human being, why shouldn't you decide for yourself? You review the evidence, you decide, you figure out whatever the benefits are of marijuana, whatever the downsides are, and you decide for yourself. And if you change your mind, you change your mind. That's what freedom is about. It's not about whether marijuana is good or bad. It's about who chooses.
Please give a round of applause to Bill Montgomery and Marc Baker.